Good.
One of my former students from Salem State, Terrence, not only worked on the dig, but actually lives literally on the banks of the Great Works, Mill. It's one of these small little things. We're ready to go? Okay. So, again, thanks for coming. This is just really wonderful. Trip down memory lane. And amazing is I actually recognize most folks here. I don't remember his name, I apologize. Oh, wow. So what I sort of thought this would kind of be a cool time to do is sort of talk about the lasting legacy that Chadbourne did, which to some degree actually becomes an excuse to show off some more cool things, and also to talk about what's next for doing studying all this stuff, because I know some of us are still very interested in it. I hope you enjoyed it. You saw the loop. Those are all Whitney Persick's slides over 500 that we were showing before. And again, that's like a trip down memory lane, seeing so yeah, the Chadbourne Day is kind of, it was one of the, and I always was, Nicole, I always wanted to be really careful. I said this a number of times with the board over the years. I don't want the dig to become the tail that's wagging the dog, you know? But it really was one of these, I think, really an amazing sort of transformative thing. But I'd say too, you know, not just for the society, but maybe for a lot of us, you know, really too, right? I mean, I think it was, hey Nicole, Nicole, I don't mean to embarrass you on the spot. I mean, I remember, I think it was year 2, when you were out at the site, very pregnant,
yes.
Even digging, you know? And
yes.
I think about transformations, so we think of those, or our daughters who were like this tall when they were digging and are, you know, like now 20 and 30 something, you know? It's kind of amazing to see those connections over the years, right, the generational.
And Paul with his tractor filling in the holes every year.
Paul with his John Deere. We never could have done the dig without Paul backfilling every year. And that was the one day when the volunteers seemed to be real scarce. And it was usually like Rich and Dick and I. I think you made it a few times. Yeah, James was usually there too.
Always.
And that was always we always know the dig always took place in the hottest days of the year, right? No matter when we were going to dig, we knew ahead of time. In fact, that happened early in the summer when my daughter Sarah and I were doing a brief dig at the Frost Garrison in Elliott. And I knew when I picked the days a couple weeks ahead that would be the hottest day of the summer. Those are those really hellacious days just before the 4th of July. Anyhow, so think about this. In some ways, the Chadbourne dig sort of begat, it's like very sort of biblical here, sort of begat Forgotten Frontier and all that really wonderful work that Nina did such an amazing job on. It was really a pleasure to work with her on it as well. And all the pieces to that, you know, the teacher workshop, exhibit catalog. If you haven't seen that, don't own a copy. Copies for sale downstairs, folks. It's amazing, really amazing. And then I think at the end of it, a lot of people say, oh, gosh, this has to go away after a couple of years. Like, yes, this is a temporary exhibit. So in this sense, Forgotten Frontier kind of begat Berwick Begins, right? Sort of the tip of the iceberg. But also, so, you know, there's that ongoing drive to really understand this region and its history. And Old Berwick is such an amazing organization, you know. I mean, until very recently, all volunteer. And even now, Gary Ford is largely volunteer, right?
Yeah.
Especially even as part-time director, we know, probably, you know, let's put it this way, probably not commensurate with the amount of hours that you actually put into this kind of work, right? So, still largely volunteer efforts that amazing things, I think. I like to point to it as sort of as a model of the incredible things that they do here. By the way, if you watched Channel 6 the news the other night, you actually saw, they did a story on 207 on the Scots of Maine. And it started off as the Highland Games, and then at the end it morphed, and they had a fellow talking about research on the Scots. And in the background, you know, only us who knew recognized it. In the background, they were showing cuts from when Channel 6 had done a couple of episodes here, What Are Bilgrins, Maine, based on the Scottish soldiers. They were interspersing in there, yeah, exactly. So, again, it's all out there, right? And again, based on archaeology, the panel shows down there. And just a couple things I want to point out is that we are continuing to learn about the artifacts and about the site and the people. And yes, the book that I am working on is going to be a material culture book on Maine in the 17th century from the perspective of the Forgotten Frontier. And on sabbatical this spring, I thought I'd make really good headway on it. Then I got dragged into several other really interesting archaeology projects. And long story short is now I find myself not just having to write that book, but 3 others. Which and I are finally going to write our book on historic beers, which you know I'm fond of. And then there's also a couple others, one on the Fifth site, and then I've decided I really have to write a sequel to Storm of Witchcraft on the aftermath of the Salem witch trials. You know, I think it's sort of the time to write that book about sort of, you know, loss and trauma and healing from 1692 to today. But I guess that means that we got to live at least another couple decades, all right? So, anyhow, and that's why it's wonderful having a physical therapist as a wife too. Some of the so we're constantly learning, and the materials here are constantly sort of referred to by people. You know, actually, Diane, you've probably been over with Megan and some of her students when we looked at this stuff. You know, Megan, how we brings her students over to take a look at this for the things and that. And some of the things we're learning even more about what stuff was. So, for example, this stuff that we never could identify, we finally figured out about 8 or 10 years ago that it was Portuguese corseware. When we had Tanya Casimiro, the world's leading expert on porcelain colonial ceramics, visit from Portugal, and I happen to have this in a box with some other stuff. Said, "Oh, that's Portuguese too." I'm like, "No, really? Seriously?" So all these kinds of things that we're learning. And speaking of which, too, yeah, maybe that's the big story, is that even though we think of the Piscataqua as being an English settlement, we have all this Portuguese stuff that's showing up here. Amazing connections as a part, and again, hello, part of the Atlantic trade. You know, fish in Newfoundland, in New England, to the Caribbean, slaves, sugar, over to Iberia, to Portugal, where it's traded for wine. There's a really wonderful book by the late Peter Pope from Memorial University. He's a really good historical archaeologist. And so it's a book called Turning Fish into Wine. And it's all about this process in the North Atlantic world. And in it, by the way, are people like, the Shapley family. And John Trewergy, Lucy Chadbourne's brother, who was governor of Newfoundland under Cromwell. Right? I mean, and all of these connections throughout the region. And all of these sites start finding all these Portuguese ceramics all over the place. It's very pretty stuff that, again, 20 years ago we would have said, oh, that's English and Dutch, but it's not. And we have the individual patterns and the date ranges on it, and it's really, these are the kinds of things that we're learning. And there's actually, the latest was Dennis Robinson in his book on Newcastle, which is coming out this winter, I think it is, certainly later this year, for the 40th anniversary of 1623, right? He came across a document where the Governor Bellamont of Massachusetts in New England in 1699 was writing to the King and the Board of Trade complaining that his own deputy governor, Partridge, in Portsmouth, Great Island, was actually sending lumber directly to Portugal, which was, of course, breaking all the navigation records. So, I mean, these people were in open violation of the law. So it's not surprising that we have a few souvenirs there. Anyhow, and by the way, haven't fully figured out this plate, a press molded plate, very fancy, but I found this one in Lisbon about 1630, which is similar. So we're making progress on this stuff. And also finding, speaking of rabbits, I'll get to that, I'll get to the rabbit in a second. Identifying other collections. This is a site actually that Dick and I did back in 2007. Some others in the room I know volunteered on it as well. James, I know you did. Rich. Came out on weekends and worked. Yeah. This is another piece of Portuguese ware, and you can see where actually it was made in pieces. It was. I thought it was very good. We good? What was in that orange juice? All right. Anyhow, Portuguese, and we now know specifically, this is kind of what a whole piece of it would look like. It's called a bead pattern. So we can identify sort of specific patterns, and the Portuguese are doing a lot of amazing things too. So this is just one example of the kinds of things that we're learning from these local collectors, particularly too, not just the Chadbourne site, but all these other sites in the Piscataqua region where we're learning so much more about what life was like in the 17th century, even since Forgotten Frontier, right? And again, speaking of rabbits, and again, it's almost, I can't tell, it looks like sort of like a satanic rabbit or something. Something reminding me of the Monty Python. This is called the Aranjo pattern, which traces Portuguese from a large hairy spider pattern, which is actually an imitation of Chinese export porcelain in the Lee pattern. But I point out this plate here, this amazing plate here, because, check this out, That's that photograph of that plate with pictures of an almost identical sort of plate
Yeah.
that Kathy Wheeler found when she dug at the Jackson House a few years ago.
Yeah.
In a context of about, there was a drain at the front of the foundation that she excavated, dated to about the 1680s. And so, again, we keep on making these kinds of connections. Oh, and of course, the Jackson family was from the next village over in Devon, from where the Shapleys came from. So all of these people knew each other, right? So having said that too, so not just sort of all that kind of work, but there's more current research going on that's really cool too. And if any of you have not heard of the Preble site, it is incredible, or it was incredible. It's gone now. It's now a subdivision. Let's see if this doesn't sound familiar, folks, to the Chadbourne site. And by the way, here's what the phase 3A in October, and yeah, cellar over here, going that way. Earth-fast woodline cellar, does this sound familiar? Another earth-fast woodline cellar there. And you have this sounds familiar to Palisade, and then it sounds familiar to the others, Tad and James, down out there as usual digging. We were volunteering, this wasn't our project.
Right.
This was directed by Sarah Loftus from Northeast Archaeological Research out in Burlington. At this point, they said, you know, there's a lot more over there, so in fact, yeah, they came back and dug more, and there was the next phase that way. If you visit York Street now, you'll see that. But first, I want to point out, this is kind of like Crocodile Dundee moment when I saw this palisade. You know, it's like when he says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." Well, that's not a palisade. That's a palisade, right? Really interesting. Very different palisades, very tiny, minuscule, petite things. But the bottom line is they actually were able to complete those where we think the Chadbournes put way too much effort digging this thing and never closed the compound and had to abandon it in 1690. And I want to point out, actually, I don't know if you remember Danielle Diego, a volunteer, she's one of the Hamilton students at USM. I should say Dr. Danielle Diego, not Diego. I just read, I haven't been in touch with Danielle, but I read this about a month ago. She just won the Society of American Archaeology's Dissertation Award. You only give out one a year, right? High honor. So she's completed her dissertation at University of California, I think Santa Barbara. Beads, Bullets, and Brokerage, Exploring Economic Agency in 18th Century West Florida. Definitely have to read that. Well, my point is, this is one example, I just out of the blue. I said, I'm going to put the slide there. Oh, that's Danielle. You know, I mean, I think we can often think about how the different ways that the Chadbourne did maybe intersected and impacted our lives in one way or another. Hopefully for the good. I don't know, like I said, I'm not sure about my knees, maybe. They appreciated it, which is the stage. So yeah, Palisade churches of all types, particularly Preble site, again, like, you're not going to captive audience of this and you love this stuff, so this is kind of like archaeology. This is such an amazing project. The developer was putting in the middle of York a piece of land that had not been disturbed since 1640s when it was first settled. Huge subdivision, 150 houses on it, 150 acres now. And the developer insisted that the work be done in February. So independent archaeology, now I'm called by Jesse Copley's partner, Jake Miller, and Peter Morrison directed the dig there. And again, James and I just love freezing to death on a dig. February, so we were out there volunteering as well. This is the completed dig. And guess what? Aerial photography by Stefan Gleason, another archaeologist who worked on the Chadbourne site when he was a kid. Well, a young professional. This is what that site looked like, fully excavated. We excavated this whole tent about, it was about 50 by 80. Took it all down to its features, and you can see a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cellars, all but one being earth-fast wood lined. And then look at these lines. Those are palisade lines. See that?
Mm-hmm.
Look at them. I got a PowerPoint presentation I can send folks the link to if they want to. You can see this whole talk again. And then probably down here is the compound over here. So again, we now know from work later on the spring, this one wall of the palisade is 100 feet long. And now here's the thing about this site though. This is the anti-Chadbourne site because this was the one of 3 places in York that survived the York raid in 1692. I think in part because they actually completed the palisade, right? But all of these, so in other words, there was a number of buildings inside that compound, and And then actually, later on, when this rotted, they built a second palisade over here. And it actually went right through this early cellar. It's just incredible. So this is what it kind of looks like from the distance. You can just see all the cellars. It was really, and this is, there were almost 200 features at the site, I think. Just incredible. So imagine all the Chadbourne site was excavated at once. This is kind of what it might look like. So it's kind of a rare treat to see this and be a part of it. But again, to me, kind of, and here's the Palisades City. There's one, and then there's two over there. And there'll be more work. They're still analyzing the artifacts, and there's going to be a lot more work coming out of this, I think, from Jesse and from Peter coming forward. With this sort of a hint of it. And also, too, as the artifacts were coming out, so here's a fortified compound controlled by a militia officer. The Kerbal family are one of the leading families of the region, sounding a bit like the Chadbournes, right? Look at the artifacts. Cosmetry button made with silver weld thread. High-end stuff. Where have we seen these before? At the Chadbournes. How about some spoons? Here's a Latin alloy Triffid spoon, 1680, 1710. We found 3 spoon bowls nearby as well. So again, late 17th century, just about what you'd expect to find. Like the Chadbournes, but if we didn't find one a year, it was a bad move. By the way, you almost never find these things cold. But again, difference. This never burned down. They continued living there. They survived. No, Latin alloy. So it's like pewter-like, but not quite. Oh, and by the way, more West Country clay tobacco pipes. Again, just like at the Chadbourne site. Does this sound familiar? How about some North Devon Sgraffito? This stuff was coming out of one cellar, like this big pieces of red brick. Look at that large chunk of North Devon. Where have we seen this before? Yeah, downstairs. Right? Oh, and by the way, is the dog nose spoon, which is actually very similar, really kind of a trick of sorts. Right? It's a variation. And that's the one that actually we worked threw up from the fish ladder up to Paul. So we're saying, so you're interested in old stuff? What do you think about this? And he's going like, yeah, thanks. That's like a 30-year-old spoon. Anyhow, speaking of Devonwares, other project is really the latest iteration of this kind of work. Alex Martin and I have been working for a few years now with folks at the Newcastle Historical Society, who have this amazing collection of artifacts gathered over about a decade of diving by a father-son sport diving team, the Demers, late Ray Demers and his son John. And, oh, by the way, how did I originally get involved with this? Oh, Wendy Persick had an old pal in Newcastle and said, hey, Tad, could you help these folks out because they got all this really amazing stuff, and it looks kind of like Chadbourne. And sure. So what, about 5 or 6 years later now, Alex and I are cataloging this collection, and it is the most incredible collection of 17th century ceramics in particular I've ever seen. Has no provenance because this was gathered by sport divers. The provenance is Piscataqua River over by Newcastle. So as an archaeologist at one level, whenever I show the archaeologists and stuff and they hear that, they kind of sort of go to tears. And they say, but think about this. All of this stuff was coming into the Piscataqua or going out of in that time and gives us the material culture. And again, we get really excited when we find a piece like that, and here we got the whole thing. I mean, look at these pieces. Sgraffito. And and a lot of these are bird patterns. This piece that Alien Avenue dug at Deer Street that's in the Strawberry Bag collections, early 18th century context, again, more birds. And in fact, actually, yeah, the whopper of the piece in the Demers collection is one of them is this bird. Just amazing. So, and it's so cool to have this stuff nearby so we can use it sort of, again, like working with people sort of saying like, okay, so, see this? That's what it would look like, right? And to think that all the stuff was coming in, most of the stuff, maybe all like, I think there's one large shipload with a lot of stuff, I think. Because also, the North Devon gravel timber is, yeah, this is scary. This is maybe half of it. And again, another reason why my wife is eligible for sainthood, because she let me take over the dining room for her. The good news is that we now know that this is only about maybe half of the North Devonware, so don't worry, I won't bring it up.
Yeah, right.
And remember on the Chadbourne dig, those are Beau's feet right there. And when we found this, which you can kind of see in the dark there, and this is what it is, and it's actually downstairs, I pulled it out, you can see the pieces move back together. We were so excited to find this is like a huge amount of North Devon. I mean,
Right.
we have almost full milk pans there. Just amazing. And all whole reconstructed pieces as well, everywhere. And also pieces from all over the Atlantic world. Matter of fact, anybody like German stoneware? Yeah. So as I said, this is like kind of archaeology. Look at this stern group, German stern jug in the 1660s with the line and just more belly jugs. There's actually one bottle, and now it's still worked. Just so amazing stuff that we're starting. So Alice and I are currently cataloging the collection, and we're actually bringing in experts to take a look at it and help us identify. Friend the Facebook page, not only for Old Berwick Historical Society, but also Newcastle Historical Society, Newcastle, New Hampshire Historical Society, because I'm trying to, once we post a ceramic find, and I've got friends from all over who are interested in this stuff, and experts commenting on some of these pieces as well to help identify. And again, guess what? The stuff helps confirm what we found. We found this little piece at the Preble site in Cellar 3 up here, and I immediately said, oh yeah, I know what that is. This is what a hole looks like, because this is in the diverse collection. And it's a Baroque pattern, Baroque garlands pattern, and again, Portuguese faience, probably 1660 to 1690. But again, like, this is almost unheard of to be able to have things like that to play with. So, yeah, most Wednesday mornings, Alex and I, that's where we are, out on Great Island. This is the collection out in some storage, and there's actually literally 5 of those vintages that are just filled with wood. It's amazing. And it's not just ceramic stacks, it's a stack of pewter plates, all kinds of stuff, boxes of tobacco pipes. What bothered me, is I right up in these larger pieces right here. All of the stuff here, huge piece of crockery. Those are pieces from a sugar refinery, ceramics. There's tubs, and then the tops of the sugar cones with holes in the bottom that you drain to make, we think of sugar cones as being like this for the table, right? These are like sugar cones that are like this, and they drain the molasses out through the bottom, and then the molasses goes to the bottom and you sugar. Long story short, there was a sugar refinery in Portsmouth in the mid-18th century. By the way, this is getting to the next step, which is talking about the connections to slavery and all that nasty stuff, which was going on here. And I'm sure that these were vessels that were intended to go to Portsmouth for the sugar refinery. Okay, so that just gives you some of those connections. So, okay, Dad, what's next? Well, let me introduce Landscapes of Nature. So, Old Berwick Historical Society has received a grant of $53,500 from the East Point Fund of the Maine Community Foundation. That's an organization that contributed quite a bit to Forgotten Frontier projects. Yay! So, what are we going to do with this money? We're doing Landscapes of Nature. This is the first part of it. And what it really is, this is, for Old Berwick, this is that continuation of Old Berwick's efforts to study, preserve, promote the early history of the Berwicks and the Piscataqua region. And again, it builds on all of this previous work, right? On the Chadbourne Dam, on Forgotten Frontier, on Berwick Beacons. And so it's really exciting to be able to continue this work. What does it do specifically? Well, we are going to learn about even more, right, John? About the Scottish prisoners of war. John Demos in the back has done an amazing amount of research on it. Nobody of the others have to. Bruce Tucker, who actually first turned us on to some of this stuff many years ago, I remember when he gave a talk to a full house over at the Federated Church in Kilt. We haven't, I'm scarred by now.
Legs for it anymore.
This project will specifically focus on the Scottish prisoners of war, and again, who came here in the 1650s. Most of you know about them, but if you're not familiar, the impact that these fellows had, who arrived here as prisoners of war in late 1650 and after the Battle of Dunbar, early 1652 after the Battle of Worcester. Heavy-duty laborers working in the sawmill, working in the Saugus Ironworks, doing that heavy work that no one in their right minds that wasn't an indentured servant or in some sort of forced labor would do, right? And so they come here and they find it's pretty good, there's land available for us, and they stay. And of course, this is a map that Nina did for the traveling exhibit that was here from Durham University last year, showing some of the key places where the Dunbar Scots alone, not to mention the Worcester Scots, is another group of them, we all told that there's 15 or 20 of them that lived, like in the Berwicks and over the line in Elliott, of this group. And the impact these people had on the early community, I mean, the name, right? When Berwick was incorporated in 1713, this is not a coincidence. The Battle of Dunbar in 1650 took place only several miles from the borough of North Berwick, Scotland. They originally called the parish of Elliott in this region Unity Parish, which was the name of the ship that brought them over. They were held captive in the Durham Cathedral, right? Where a lot of them end up going over into Oyster River, which was, of course, I think, was pretty sure it was named Durham after them too. So they left a lasting imprint here. As a matter of fact, there's a 1711 militia list. And if you look at that list, of the 96 names, 23 are Scots. So that means about 25% of the population of Berwick, by the time it is incorporated as a town, is made up of the Scots, their families, and descendants. That's a significant impact. So that's the folks that we're really kind of focusing on, in part because of this really fascinating story about them and the trauma that they suffered. But also, too, we really are specifically landscapes of indenture. We are looking at the landscape and the societal transformation that was taking place as these new frontier societies arrive in places like the Piscataqua, like the Saugus Ironworks, and are doing what my friend Jeff Bolster calls the first clear cuts in American history, right? Looking at the impact of that, of the fishing, where we're causing fish extinctions of the large megacod by the late 17th century. We're altering the landscape in ways, and in order to do this, you need cheap labor to do it. Where are we going to get cheap labor, folks? How about indentured Scots prisoners of war to start with, right? So let's look at the impact of this technology, like sawmills, sawmill hardware, the Chadbournes, and look at the influx of that technology on these populations of forced labor, and what's the landscape like that they left behind. The last of the Scottish indentures of 7 years would have ended in 1659. Some of them were free before then, but particularly the Worcester guys got over here like in May of 1652. So by the summer of 1659, your 7-year term would have been done. Some of these guys probably worked for the Chadbournes. We only have Humphrey's 1667 inventory, where it says 5 serving men and maids worth 40 pounds. That, by the value of that, by the way, definitely indentured servants. Definitely. Not enough money to be slaves, to be worth more, maybe 10 or 15 pounds a piece. Or 20, right? So, depending on how much service you have left. But before this time, I bet you some of those Scots were working for the ones that settled here. But think about this. This is the late 1650s. Isn't it a coincidence? No, it's not. That the first slaves start showing up in Canterbury in the 1660s. This is not a coincidence, folks. We need another cheap source of labor. And don't kid yourself by saying that these were the slaves here were status symbols who were house servants. These were status symbols who were put to work in the sawmills, chopping down lumber, etc., etc., etc. And look at this even. Lucy Chadbourne's second husband, Thomas Wells, his probate inventory of 1688 includes 1 Negro man valued at 12 pounds. Or, a few years earlier, Lucy's uncle, Nicholas Shapley, in his inventory included 5 enslaved people valued at 90 pounds. So they're taking advantage of these forms of labor working in their sawmills. So we want to study that. And so specifically, what are we going to do to wrap this up? We want to look at them ultimately on both sides of the Atlantic, the Scots before and after the battles. Eventually, we want to have some work done in Scotland. What did a Scottish farmstead look like in the mid-17th century? What would the house look like, right, Richard? What would the outbuildings look like? What sort of field pattern would they use to farm them? What would their livestock have been like? What was their diet like? All of these kinds of things. So when we find one of their sites over here, we'll know what to look for. To what degrees does it reflect Scottish traditions Or to what degrees are these guys who are like forced to live in this English world, and they're using English material culture, but in weird ways. The one guy, example I like to cite about this is one of the Grants, who, just he and his wife, they never had children, yet he managed to have 3 Bibles and 13 porringers. Porringers for eating, I assume, okay, so I'm assuming this is the place where the Scots gathered to read the Bible, because these were Presbyterians, and they also probably had the meal of Scottish oatmeal porridge. I don't know, I can't prove that, but that's the way they would have used English material culture in Scottish ways, maybe, okay? So that's some of the kinds of things we want to look at. What was going on in Scotland? What about documentary research? We have about 150 Scots from Dunbar, about 250 more from Worcester. Where'd they go? Did they leave a probate inventory? Did they leave a potential archaeology site? A lot of these guys ended up in places like Salem. And the grad student was working on it said, Ted, I'm really excited. I think I found one of these living on the Salem Marblehead line. And we're like, yeah, Megan, that's called Binnen Square, and we're not going to find anything there. It's like paved over. But if we come up here, so can we find out what they left behind? So here's some of the things we want to do. LiDAR drone survey to identify the features and the sites, which also might even show us some field patterns. Right? If you don't know what LiDAR is, it's basically laser emitting aerial photography, and it can show minute differences in soils. Google LiDAR written Roman road, and you'll see fields that don't look like anything until you do LiDAR on them. You can see the Roman road, and you can see the Roman town, and then you see the Anglo-Saxon village, and all this kind of stuff, all through LiDAR. It's abandoned medieval villages. Amazing. So we want to do some of that around here. Let's do, if we have any buildings associated with these fellows. We know of at least one down in Wynnum, the Claflin Richards house. Can we actually date? Maybe we can get permission to do other places, like there's a house down in Massachusetts that the Upton family built in the late 17th, early 18th century. We've already got permission to do dinner archaeology there. I'd love to do the Mark McIntyre Garrison. We really need to reach out to the Davis family to see if we would like, let us see if we can date it. Right? Because we know, based on Richard's work, 1707 at the earliest, but when exactly? Right? So we want to do dinner archaeology, we want to do LiDAR, pollen analysis, do sediment cores in ponds. We should be able to date those, and then again, there should be a real change here in the 1650s and 60s with the sawmills as far as no more hardwood, it's all being used for shipbuilding, no more softwoods, it's all going to be carved up as well, and you're going to see a very different landscape here, pollen even, so things like that. So a lot of work now, I'm nearing retirement, which to some degrees, as Peggy recognizes, means I'll have more time to play with this. We'll get all those books written. But it takes a lot of people to do this, and so we're continuing partnerships that we've developed here at Old Berwick and at Salem State for many years. Chris Gerard, my good friend from Durham University, who actually was over here pre-COVID and started to plant some of this stuff. If you haven't seen their book from Durham, Lost Lives, New Voices on the Scottish prisoners, you must read. Chris and Durham Archaeology Department are very interested and involved in this project. This PhD student, Megan Olszewski, has got a fellowship at Harvard this fall, so she'll be in residence over here. If that name sounds familiar to some of you who were involved when John Cryer did the Who Do You Think You Are episode, Megan was one of the historical researchers who thought it was such a fascinating topic, decided to go back and get her PhD in archaeology and to work on it. And she'll be coming over within a week or so, and we'll be starting to work on this. Again, going through the probate records, going through the wills, going through the cemeteries, looking for sites, the deeds, where do people live, what can we find, and again, building that stuff like the work that John has done, that Bruce has done in the past, that Nina's done, to really sort of begin to figure out where a lot of these folks live, and is there potential for archaeology on some of these properties? We already know about a half dozen, right, we're working on it. Also, working too with Megan Howie at UNH, and also too, eventually hopefully with Solomon Michael Palace, who does all of their LiDAR work and Mount Sensing work at Palace. And this really kind of is going to be, it's, I guess, related at this stage, we're not quite sure how yet, to the work that Megan's been doing for some time on the Great Bay Archaeology Survey. And Dick and Diane are both very much involved in that project, and knowing we're sort of conspiring to do this sort of stuff as well, because maybe we can get some good field schools and some good students out working on one or two of these sites eventually. We got some interesting ones on that side of the river too. But Megan says, yeah, we can dig on this side of the river too. So we got some interesting things coming there too. And also too, Saugus Ironworks, Emily Murphy, chief curator there and Gavin Gardner, regional archaeologist, are both involved in this, and in fact, actually, they're starting to do some work down at Saugus Ironworks. So work on the grant is really starting this fall, and some of it's like, we basically, what the grant is that we got the money for is kind of a pilot project to do a little bit of this stuff to see if it'll really work and as a project. And if it does, we establish a budget. Our ultimate goal is to try to apply for a big grant. There's a joint pool of funding available from the United Kingdom and the RNSF that we would hope to eventually target. We're doing now to get proof of concept. Will this work? And if so, how can we make it work? Actually, starting in a week or so, Saugus Ironworks is going to be doing just a very limited test pitting on the east bank there of the Saugus Ironworks, which is a site that has kind of got a lot of landfill on it, but it's an area where they think Scottish soldiers might have lived. So they're going to try to see if they can even find an original landscape there to try to do some work on. So that'd be kind of cool. Megan will be here this fall, and we'll be spending some time up here. Again, like scoping out areas, looking for sites, doing deed research in Alfred and all these other things. Because that's what her dissertation is really going to be on. It's on the Scots. She's focusing particularly initially on the ones in the Saugus Ironworks, and where they would, a lot of them ended up here too, folks, including the grants. And then hopefully later on this fall, we may do some LiDAR work. Next spring, we'll do some pollen cores, some dendrochronology. Bill Flint, formerly the archaeological conservator at the Short Deer Field, has agreed to work with us to as part of the grant to do some dendro on some of these sites as well too. So all kinds of fun stuff happening in the next year or two, and maybe eventually even bigger than that. So immediately not a lot of digging, but you folks who know me, you know where this is hopefully going. So hopefully just the first steps in a much larger project. Thanks for coming. It's great to see you.